The Healer's Bargain. Part 1. The Village of Crescent Bay. Eliza Reed had always been good with plants. Even as a child, when the other children of Crescent Bay were splashing in tide pools or learning to mend nets, she would wander the edges of the forest, gathering herbs and flowers that seemed to call to her. Her mother had taught her which plants soothed fevers, which calmed stomachs, and which, when properly prepared, could ease the pain of childbirth. But there were some things her mother never taught her. Things Eliza learned on her own, in whispers from the plants themselves. By her 30th year, Eliza was the only healer in Crescent Bay. She lived in a small cottage at the edge of the village, where the cobbled street gave way to a dirt path that wound into the woods. Her garden sprawled in organized chaos, rosemary and sage competing with stranger herbs that had no names in the common tongue. Inside, bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters, and shelves lined with jars of tinctures, salves, and powders covered the walls. It was a good life, if a lonely one. The villagers respected her, came to her for their ailments, but kept their distance otherwise. There was something unsettling about a woman who lived alone, who knew too much about the hidden properties of plants, whose green eyes seemed to see more than they should. They whispered sometimes that she was a witch, but quietly, for when their children burned with fever or their wounds festered, it was to Eliza's door they came knocking. On a crisp autumn morning, as Eliza was harvesting the last of her summer herbs before the first frost, she heard the sound of hooves on the cobbled street. Visitors were uncommon in Crescent Bay, a small fishing village far from the main roads. Curious, she straightened, brushing soil from her hands, and watched as a man on horseback approached. He was clearly not from Crescent Bay, nor from any of the nearby villages. His clothes were finely made, a dark blue woolen cloak over a leather jerkin, high boots polished to a shine. But it was his face that caught and held Eliza's attention. Haggard, drawn with exhaustion and something else. Something she recognized all too well. Grief. The man reined in his horse before her gate. "Are you the healer they speak of in the village?" he asked, his voice rough with weariness. Eliza nodded. "I am. What ails you, traveler?" Though she could already guess it wasn't his own health that concerned him. "Not me," he said, dismounting with a wince. "My daughter. She's..." He faltered, as if speaking the words would make them more real. "She's dying. The physicians in the city have given up. They say there's nothing to be done." "And what makes you think I might succeed where city physicians have failed?" Eliza asked, not unkindly. The man's eyes, blue and intense, met hers. "They say you know things. Old knowledge. That your remedies work when others don't." "Ah, so that was it." The desperate often sought miracle cures, willing to believe any tale if it offered hope. Usually, Eliza would gently turn such cases away. She was no miracle worker, just a woman who understood plants better than most. But something in the man's face, in the quiet dignity of his desperation, gave her pause. "What is your name?" she asked. "Marcus Thorne," he replied. "Baron of East March." A nobleman, then. That explained the fine clothes and the city physicians. It did not explain why he had journeyed all this way to a remote village on the edge of nowhere. "And your daughter's ailment?" Marcus's face tightened. "A wasting sickness. It began 3 months ago. Fatigue, loss of appetite, then weakness in her limbs. Now she can barely rise from her bed, and she coughs blood. The physicians say her lungs are filling with fluid." Eliza frowned. Not a simple case, and likely beyond her skills. But she had seen similar cases before, and occasionally. "How old is your daughter, Baron Thorne?" 12. "Her name is Lily." Such a young life. Eliza sighed, already knowing she would try, however futile it might be. "I make no promises," she said firmly, "but I will come and see what might be done." Relief washed over Marcus's face, making him look suddenly younger. "Thank you. My estate lies 3 days' ride from here. I have a second horse for you, and I'll compensate you generously for your time and..." Eliza waved away his words. "I need to gather supplies. And I don't ride. We'll take my cart." An hour later, they set out from Crescent Bay, Eliza in her small cart pulled by a sturdy dappled mare, Marcus riding alongside. She had packed carefully. Dried herbs, tinctures, instruments for preparing remedies, clean bandages, and a few precious items she rarely used. Things that worked in ways she didn't fully understand herself. Things her mother had warned her to use sparingly, if at all. As they left the village behind, Eliza couldn't shake a strange feeling of inevitability, as if she were being drawn along a path laid out long ago. She had never travelled far from Crescent Bay before. Yet here she was, accompanying a nobleman to his distant estate, to treat a child she had never met, with an illness she might not be able to cure. The journey was long and tiring. They traveled from dawn until dusk each day, stopping at inns along the way. Marcus was mostly silent, lost in his worries, answering Eliza's occasional questions about his daughter with brief, pained responses. Eliza learned that Lily's mother had died in childbirth, that Lily was his only child, the light of his life, that her illness had come suddenly, without warning, and had resisted every treatment. On the third day, as afternoon yielded to evening, they crested a hill, and Eliza saw Eastmarch for the first time. It wasn't the grand castle she might have expected, but a sprawling stone manor house nestled in a valley, surrounded by neatly tended fields and a small forest. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and lanterns glowed in the windows against the gathering dusk. "It's beautiful," Eliza said softly. Marcus looked at his home with tired eyes. It used to be. They rode down to the manor in silence. Servants came out to meet them, taking Marcus's horse and helping Eliza with her cart and supplies. She was led into the house, up a grand staircase, and down a long corridor to a closed door. Marcus stopped there, his hand on the latch. "She's very weak," he warned. "The journey exhausted me. I should not have left her, but I was desperate." "I understand," Eliza said. "Let me see her now." The room beyond was dimly lit by a fire in the hearth, and a single candle beside the bed. In that bed, nearly lost among pillows and blankets, lay a small figure. As Eliza approached, she saw a thin face, pale as moonlight, framed by dark hair that seemed too heavy for the fragile neck that supported it. The girl's eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and labored. Eliza placed a gentle hand on Lily's forehead. Hot with fever, dry as autumn leaves. The child's eyes fluttered open, blue like her father's, but glazed with illness. "Who are you?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "My name is Eliza. I'm a healer. Your father brought me to help you." Lily's gaze shifted to Marcus, who had come to stand on the other side of the bed. A small smile touched her lips. "You came back." "Of course I did, little flower." Marcus's voice was tender as he took his daughter's hand. Eliza began her examination, her skilled hands gentle but thorough. She listened to Lily's chest, felt her pulse, examined her skin, her eyes, her tongue. The symptoms aligned with what Marcus had described, a wasting illness affecting the lungs, among other things. But there was something else, something that didn't fit the pattern of any disease Eliza knew. When she had finished, she straightened and met Marcus's hopeful gaze. "I need to prepare some remedies," she said, "and I'd like to speak with you privately." He nodded, bending to kiss Lily's forehead before following Eliza from the room. A servant showed them to a small study down the hall, where a fire burned in the grate and candles cast long shadows on wood-paneled walls. "What do you think?" Marcus asked as soon as the door closed behind them. "Can you help her?" Eliza chose her words carefully. "Her condition is grave, as you know. I can prepare medicines that may ease her symptoms, reduce the fever, help her breathe more easily. But I don't think I can cure what ails her." Marcus's face fell, hope dying in his eyes. He sank into a chair, suddenly looking much older than his years. "Then she will die." "I didn't say that." Eliza paused, weighing how much to reveal. "There is something unusual about her illness. Something I can't quite identify." "What do you mean?" How to explain what she hardly understood herself. Sometimes, very rarely, illnesses have causes that aren't natural. Marcus stared at her. "You think she's been poisoned?" Or, his eyes widened, "You think it's witchcraft? A curse?" Eliza shook her head. "No, nothing like that. But there are older forces in the world than those we commonly acknowledge. Things that work in ways beyond our understanding." "What are you saying?" His voice hardened with suspicion. "I'm saying that I may be able to help your daughter, but not with my usual remedies. I would need to try something different, something I rarely attempt." "Magic." The word came out half scornful, half hopeful. Eliza sighed. "Not magic as you might imagine it. Just a deeper knowledge of the world's hidden workings. But I must warn you, Baron Thorn, such methods come with risks. And costs. I'll pay whatever you ask." "I don't mean money," Eliza said quietly. "Some debts can't be paid in gold." Marcus stood, his face resolute. "Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, if there's even a chance you can save Lily, I beg you to try." Eliza studied him, seeing the desperation in his eyes, the love for his daughter that drove him. She understood that love, though she had never had a child of her own. She understood what it was to care for someone so deeply that you would do anything to protect them. "Very well," she said at last. I'll need specific herbs, some I brought with me, others I must gather from the woods near your estate. And I'll need privacy for the preparation. You shall have everything you need, Marcus promised. That night, while the household slept, Eliza ventured into the small forest that bordered East March. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light through the branches. She moved with purpose, gathering what she needed. Tender new shoots of yew, mushrooms that grew only on fallen oaks, moss from the north side of ancient stones. As she worked, she sang softly, songs without words, songs her mother had taught her long ago. Back in the small chamber she had been given, she prepared her remedies. Some were ordinary. Willow bark for fever, camphor for strength, mullein for the lungs. But others were different, made from the things she had gathered under moonlight, prepared with methods passed down through generations of women in her family, women who had always lived at the edge of society, between the known and the unknown. Just before dawn, she completed her work. 3 vials sat before her on the table, one of clear liquid, one of amber, and one as dark as night. She stared at them for a long moment, then carefully gathered them up and made her way to Lily's chamber. The girl was awake, her breathing more labored than before. Marcus sat beside her bed, haggard from a sleepless night. He looked up as Eliza entered, hope and fear warring in his eyes. I've prepared what she needs, Eliza said, showing him the vials. The clear one will ease her pain and help her breathe. The amber will fight the fever. These are ordinary remedies, though potent. And the third? Marcus asked, eyeing the dark vial. Eliza hesitated. That one is different. It's what I spoke of last night. It may help with the underlying cause of her illness, but... She met his gaze directly. It comes with a price. A balance must be maintained. What price? I don't know exactly, Eliza admitted. That's the nature of such things. But it will be proportional to what is gained. A life saved requires something of equal value. Marcus didn't hesitate. Give it to her. All of them. Eliza nodded, approaching Lily's bedside. The girl looked at her with clear eyes, surprisingly lucid. Am I going to die? Lily asked quietly. Eliza sat on the edge of the bed. Not if I can help it, she said with a gentle smile. I've made some medicines for you. They won't taste pleasant, but they'll help you feel better. Lily nodded bravely. I'm not afraid of bad tastes. Eliza administered the first 2 remedies, helping Lily drink them despite her weakness. Almost immediately, the girl's breathing seemed to ease slightly, and some of the tension left her small frame. Then Eliza uncorked the 3rd vial, the dark one. She hesitated, looking from Lily to Marcus. Are you certain? She asked him one last time. Yes, he said without hesitation. Eliza nodded, then turned back to Lily. This last one is special, she explained. After you drink it, you'll sleep. When you wake, you should feel much better. Will you still be here when I wake up? Lily asked. The question caught Eliza off guard. Yes, she found herself saying. I'll be here. Satisfied, Lily allowed Eliza to help her drink the dark liquid. It went down in 3 small swallows. Lily made a face at the bitter taste, then settled back against her pillows. Within moments, her eyes grew heavy, and she drifted into sleep. Now what? Marcus asked, watching his daughter's face anxiously. Now we wait, Eliza said, settling into a chair on the opposite side of the bed. And we hope. Through the day and into the night, they kept vigil. Lily slept deeply, her breathing gradually becoming easier, more regular. The flush of fever faded from her cheeks, leaving them pale but no longer burning. Occasionally, Eliza would check her pulse, listen to her chest, nod to herself in cautious satisfaction. Marcus refused to leave, even when Eliza suggested he rest. Servants brought food that he barely touched. He spoke little, his eyes rarely leaving his daughter's face. Near midnight, Eliza sensed a change. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, as if a storm approached. She felt a familiar prickling at the back of her neck, the feeling she sometimes got when working with her most potent remedies, when the boundary between the known world and the hidden one grew thin. Something's happening, she said softly. Marcus looked up sharply. What? Is she worse? No. Eliza shook her head, watching Lily closely. I think it's working. As if in response to her words, Lily took a deep breath, then another. Color began to return to her cheeks. Her eyelids fluttered, and then opened. She looked around, confused at first, then focusing on her father. Papa, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Lily. Marcus grabbed her hand, tears streaming down his face. How do you feel, little flower? Lily considered this, as if surprised by the question. Hungry, she said at last. Marcus laughed through his tears, a sound of pure joy. He looked across at Eliza, his face transformed with gratitude. You did it, he said in wonder. You actually did it. Eliza smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She could feel it now, the price being exacted. Not from Lily, not from Marcus, but from herself. A coldness spreading through her limbs, a heaviness in her chest. The balance being restored. I'll have the kitchen prepare something light for her, she said, rising from her chair. Broth to start, then perhaps some bread if she can manage it. She'll need to rebuild her strength slowly. Marcus nodded, too overcome with joy to notice Eliza's pallor, the slight tremor in her hands. She left the room quietly, pausing in the corridor to lean against the wall, fighting a wave of dizziness. So this is the price, she thought. A fitting exchange, perhaps. She made her way to the kitchen, gave instructions for Lily's meal, then returned to her own chamber. There, she sat heavily on the edge of the bed, her breath coming in short gasps. She had known there would be a cost, but had not expected it to claim its due so quickly. A soft knock came at her door. Enter, she called, straightening with effort. It was Marcus, his face glowing with joy and relief. She's eaten, he said. Not much, but it's the first food she's kept down in days. And she's sitting up talking. It's miraculous. Eliza managed a smile. I'm glad. She should continue to improve, though she'll need time to fully recover. Keep her warm, make sure she eats and drinks regularly. The other remedies I prepared will help with any lingering symptoms. Marcus crossed to her, taking her hands in his. How can I ever thank you? You've given me back my daughter, my world. Name your reward, and if it's in my power to grant, it's yours. Eliza gently withdrew her hands from his. I require no payment beyond what's already been taken, she said quietly. Marcus frowned, noticing for the first time how pale she looked, the sheen of sweat on her brow. Are you unwell? You look tired, Eliza cut in. It's been a long few days, and the remedies I prepared required considerable effort. I just need rest. He hesitated, clearly concerned, but his joy over Lily's improvement outweighed all else. Of course. Rest as long as you need. You're welcome to stay at East March until you're fully recovered. In fact, I insist upon it. Thank you, Eliza said, knowing she had little choice. In her current state, she couldn't make the journey back to Crescent Bay. After Marcus left, she lay back on the bed, not bothering to undress. The heaviness in her chest had intensified, and each breath was an effort. She knew what was happening. The illness that had afflicted Lily was transferring to her. Not all of it, she hoped, but enough to satisfy the balance that must be maintained. A life for a life, or in this case, perhaps health for health. She drifted into uneasy sleep, waking occasionally to cough or to fight for breath. By morning, a fever had taken hold, though not as severe as Lily's had been. She managed to rise, to wash her face and change her dress, but the effort left her trembling with exhaustion. When a servant came to invite her to breakfast, she sent her regrets, asking only for tea. She spent the day in her room, resting, preparing simple remedies from her supplies to ease her own symptoms. She knew she could not cure herself completely. That would undo what she had done for Lily. But she could make the burden more bearable. In the evening, there was another knock at her door. This time, when she called for the visitor to enter, it was Lily who appeared, supported by her father. The girl looked remarkably improved, still thin and pale, but standing on her own feet, her eyes bright and alert. Miss Eliza, Lily said with a shy smile. I wanted to thank you for making me better. Eliza sat up in bed, ignoring the pain in her chest. You're very welcome, Lily. I'm so glad to see you up and about. Lily approached the bed, studying Eliza's face with surprising perception. You're sick now, she said, not a question but a statement of fact. Marcus looked alarmed. Eliza, you said you were just tired. Are you ill? It's nothing serious, Eliza lied smoothly. A mild fever, that's all. Probably caught on our journey here. Lily frowned, unconvinced. It's because of me, isn't it? You took my sickness away, and now you have it. Out of the mouths of children, Eliza thought. They so often saw what adults missed. No, Lily, she said gently. That's not how healing works. I just need rest, as you do. But Lily was perceptive beyond her years. She looked at Eliza with those clear blue eyes, and Eliza knew she wasn't fooled. I'm sorry, the girl said softly. Don't be, Eliza replied, meaning it. I chose to help you, and I would do so again. Marcus, looking increasingly concerned, ushered his daughter toward the door. Come, Lily, we should let Miss Eliza rest. We'll visit again tomorrow." After they left, Eliza lay back, closing her eyes against a wave of pain. She didn't regret her choice, seeing Lily standing, speaking, alive with possibility. That was worth whatever price she had to pay. But she wondered how high that price would ultimately be. Part 2. The Price of Healing. Days passed, marking the transition from autumn to early winter. Outside the windows of East March, the last leaves fell from the trees, and the first light snowfall dusted the fields. Inside, 2 healings progressed, one rapid and miraculous, the other slow and painful. Lily improved daily. Her strength returned, her appetite grew robust, and soon she was wandering the halls of East March, exploring the grounds when weather permitted, reclaiming her life with the resilience of youth. She visited Eliza often, bringing books to read aloud or simply sitting quietly, sometimes asking questions about Eliza's life in Crescent Bay, about the plants she worked with, about the nature of healing itself. Eliza, in contrast, weakened steadily. The cough that had begun as a minor irritation grew more severe, racking her body with spasms that sometimes brought up flecks of blood. Her fever came and went, leaving her alternately burning and chilled. The weight fell from her frame, her green eyes seeming larger in her gaunt face. Marcus watched with growing alarm. At first, he had accepted Eliza's dismissal of her illness as a passing thing. But as days stretched into weeks, as she grew visibly weaker while his daughter flourished, understanding dawned. He came to her chamber one evening, after Lily had gone to bed. Eliza was sitting by the window, wrapped in blankets despite the fire blazing in the hearth. She turned as he entered, offering a smile that did nothing to disguise the truth of her condition. "It's not a passing fever, is it?" Marcus said without preamble, taking the chair opposite her. This is the price you spoke of." Eliza didn't deny it. "Yes." The single word hung between them in the quiet room. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the window. "You knew this would happen," Marcus continued, his voice tight with emotion. "You knew, and you did it anyway." "I knew there would be a price," Eliza corrected. "I didn't know exactly what form it would take." She paused, looking out at the falling snow. "Though I might have guessed. Balance requires symmetry. And you didn't think to warn me more clearly? To explain what you were risking?" Eliza met his angry gaze calmly. "Would it have changed your decision? If I had said, 'I can save your daughter, but I will fall ill in her place,' would you have refused?" Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it again. They both knew the answer. After a moment, he said, "I would have asked if there was another way. There wasn't. Not in the time we had." Eliza sighed, suppressing a cough. "Don't torment yourself with guilt, Baron Thorne. I made my choice freely, knowing the risks." "Why?" he demanded. "Why would you do this for a child you didn't know, for a stranger?" Eliza considered the question. Why indeed? Because she had looked at Lily and seen a life just beginning, full of possibility. Because she had no children of her own, no one who would mourn her as Marcus would have mourned his daughter. Because in some way she couldn't articulate, it had felt right, as if she were fulfilling a purpose she hadn't known she had. "Because I could," she said simply. "Because she deserves her life." Marcus stared at her, his expression a complex mixture of gratitude, anger, and something else, something that made Eliza look away, back to the safety of the falling snow. "Is there nothing to be done?" he asked at last. "No remedy, no. Whatever it was you did for Lily. That could help you?" "No," Eliza said. "What's done is done. The balance must be maintained." "So you'll die?" His voice was flat. Eliza shook her head. "I don't think so. Not from this. I don't believe I've taken on the full force of Lily's illness. Just enough to satisfy the balance. It will be difficult for a time, but I should recover eventually." She wasn't entirely sure this was true, but she saw no reason to add to Marcus's burden. He studied her face, clearly not entirely convinced. "When you're well enough to travel, you'll return to Crescent Bay?" "Yes," though the thought of the journey, in winter no less, was daunting. Marcus stood, pacing the room in agitation. "No, that won't do. You're in no condition to travel, and won't be for some time. You'll stay here at East March until you've fully recovered." Eliza opened her mouth to protest, but he cut her off. "I insist. It's the least I can do. You sacrificed your health for my daughter. I won't repay that by sending you off to face a winter journey in your condition." Put that way, Eliza had little choice but to agree. And truthfully, the thought of returning to her empty cottage in Crescent Bay, of tending to herself through the worst of her illness, alone, was not appealing. "Very well," she said. "Thank you for your hospitality." Marcus nodded, his face solemn. It's settled then. Now, is there anything you need? Anything that might ease your symptoms? Eliza thought for a moment. There are some herbs in my supplies that would help with the cough. They're in the small wooden box with the carved lid. I'll have them prepared according to your instructions, Marcus promised. He hesitated, then added, Lily doesn't know, does she? About the connection between her recovery and your illness. She suspects, Eliza said. She's an observant child. But no, I haven't confirmed it. Good. I'd rather she didn't know. She has a tender heart. It would trouble her greatly. Eliza nodded, understanding his concern. The last thing she wanted was for Lily to feel responsible for her suffering. I won't tell her, she promised. After Marcus left, Eliza turned back to the window, watching the snow accumulate on the sill. She thought of her cottage in Crescent Bay, probably already surrounded by drifts, the garden dormant under a blanket of white. She wondered what the villagers thought of her prolonged absence. If they missed her skills, if they worried about her, if they speculated about her disappearance with the visiting nobleman. Not that it mattered. She would return when she could, and resume her life. Different, perhaps, changed by what had happened, by the knowledge gained. But essentially the same. The healer of Crescent Bay, living at the edge of the village, neither fully part of it, nor entirely separate. That night, her fever rose higher than before. She dreamed vivid, troubling dreams, of roots growing through her body, of soil filling her mouth, of flowers blooming from her eyes. She woke gasping, her nightdress soaked with sweat, to find a figure sitting beside her bed. Lily, she croaked, recognizing the girl's slender outline in the dim light of the banked fire. You were crying out in your sleep, Lily said, her voice small with concern. I heard you as I was passing. Eliza struggled to sit up, trying to gather her scattered thoughts. What time is it? Late. After midnight. Papa thinks I'm asleep. You should be, Eliza chided gently. You need your rest. Lily ignored this, leaning forward to place a cool hand on Eliza's forehead. The gesture was so like something Eliza herself would do that it almost made her smile, despite her discomfort. You're burning up, Lily said solemnly. I'll get you some water. Before Eliza could protest, the girl had slipped from the room. She returned moments later with a pitcher and cup, carefully pouring water and helping Eliza drink. Her small hands were surprisingly steady, her movements precise. Thank you, Eliza said when she had drunk her fill. She felt slightly better, the cool water soothing her parched throat. Lily set the cup aside and perched on the edge of the bed, studying Eliza with those unervingly perceptive eyes. I know what you did, she said after a moment. You took my sickness into yourself. That's why I'm better and you're worse. Eliza sighed. There seemed little point in denying it now. Yes, she admitted. Something like that. Why? Lily asked, echoing her father's question from earlier. Because you're young, Eliza said simply. Because you have your whole life ahead of you. Because your father loves you very much and would be lost without you. Lily considered this, her young face solemn in the firelight. But what about the people who love you? Won't they be sad if you die? The question struck Eliza with unexpected force. Who would truly mourn her passing? The villagers of Crescent Bay would miss her skills, certainly, but would any of them grieve for Eliza herself? There had been a man once, years ago, who might have loved her if she had let him. But she had chosen her solitary path, her communion with plants, and the hidden knowledge they contained. I don't think I'm going to die, she said, avoiding the deeper question. I'm just very ill for now. I'll get better in time. Lily didn't look convinced. Promise? I promised to try very hard, Eliza said, which was the most she could honestly offer. This seemed to satisfy Lily, who nodded solemnly. Good. Because I think my papa would be sad if you died. He looks at you the way he used to look at Mama in the portraits. Eliza blinked, taken aback by the child's observation. Before she could formulate a response, Lily continued. And I would be sad too. I like talking to you. No one else explains things to me properly. They all treat me like I'm a baby who can't understand anything. Despite her discomfort, Eliza felt a warmth that had nothing to do with her fever. I like talking to you too, Lily. You ask good questions. Lily smiled, pleased by this. Then her expression grew serious again. Is there anything I can do to help you get better? Since you helped me? Eliza thought for a moment. Actually, there might be. In my supplies, there's a small fabric pouch with dried lavender and chamomile. If you could bring it to me, I can make a sachet to help me sleep more easily. Lily nodded eagerly, happy to have a task. I'll find it right now. In the morning will be soon enough, Eliza said, seeing the girl stifle a yawn. "You should go back to bed. Your father wouldn't be pleased if he found you wandering the halls at this hour." Reluctantly, Lily agreed, but before she left, she leaned over and placed a soft kiss on Eliza's forehead. A gesture so unexpected, so tender, that Eliza felt tears spring to her eyes. "Good night, Miss Eliza," Lily whispered. "Please get better." "Good night, Lily," Eliza managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for the water." After the girl had gone, Eliza lay awake for a long time, despite her exhaustion. Lily's innocent observations about her father had unsettled her. Surely the child was mistaken. Marcus Thorne was a nobleman, a widower who had loved his wife enough that he still mourned her years after her death. Eliza was merely the woman who had saved his daughter, an object of gratitude, nothing more. Yet she couldn't deny that something had shifted in their interactions lately. The way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she wasn't aware. The way his hand lingered when he helped her from her chair, or adjusted her blankets. The way he spoke of the future, always with the assumption that she would eventually be well again, as if her recovery was essential to his own happiness. It was a complication she hadn't anticipated, and one she wasn't sure how to navigate. Especially now, when her own feelings were muddled by illness and the strange intimacy that had developed between them during her time at East March. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she fell into a dreamless sleep. Part 2. The Price of Healing. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Each morning, Lily would visit Eliza, bringing the herbs and supplies she requested, watching attentively as Eliza prepared simple remedies to ease her symptoms. In the afternoons, when Eliza rested, Marcus would often sit with her, reading aloud or simply providing quiet company. In the evenings, if she felt strong enough, she would join them for dinner in a small, comfortable dining room rather than the grand hall where the household usually ate. Winter deepened outside the windows of East March. Snow piled in drifts against the walls, and frost etched delicate patterns on the glass. Inside, fires burned day and night, keeping the cold at bay. It was a season of stillness, of waiting, for spring, for healing, for whatever might come next. Eliza's condition improved by slow degrees. The fever receded, though it still returned occasionally, especially at night. The cough remained, but grew less severe, no longer bringing up blood. She began to regain some of the weight she had lost, her face filling out a little, the shadows beneath her eyes lessening. One clear, cold morning in early January, she stood at her chamber window, watching the rising sun cast long blue shadows across the snow-covered landscape. For the first time in weeks, she felt almost like herself again. Tired, yes, and still too thin, but stronger, more present in her own body. A knock at the door roused her from her contemplation. "Come in," she called, expecting Lily with her usual morning visit. But it was Marcus who entered, carrying a small wooden box. He stopped short at the sight of her standing by the window, clearly surprised. "You're up," he said, a smile spreading across his face. "And looking better than I've seen you in weeks." Eliza smiled in return. "I feel better. Not entirely well, but improving." "That's wonderful news." He approached, setting the box down on a small table. "I found this among your things. Lily said you'd been asking for it. Something about a special tea?" Eliza recognized the box. It contained some of her more unusual herbs, things she used sparingly, things with properties not widely known. "Yes, thank you. It should help with the lingering cough." Marcus nodded, but made no move to leave. Instead, he stood awkwardly for a moment, then asked, "Do you feel well enough for a short walk?" "The corridors only. I wouldn't suggest going outside in this weather, but some gentle exercise might do you good." The invitation surprised her, but not unpleasantly. "Yes, I think I could manage that." They walked slowly through the halls of East March, Marcus matching his pace to hers. He showed her rooms she hadn't seen before. A library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, a small chapel with stained glass windows that cast colourful patterns on the stone floor, a cozy sitting room where, he explained, his late wife had spent much of her time. She was often unwell, especially after Lily was born, he said as they paused in the doorway of this last room. The birth weakened her, and she never fully recovered. Eliza heard the old grief in his voice. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Marcus nodded, his eyes distant with memory. "She was everything to me. When she died, I thought I would never feel joy again, if it hadn't been for Lily." "Children have a way of pulling us back to life," Eliza observed, though she had no personal experience of this truth. "Yes." Marcus's gaze returned to the present, focusing on Eliza with an intensity that made her look away. And then there are those rare individuals who do the same, who remind us that life is precious, worth fighting for, worth any sacrifice. The words hung between them, laden with meaning. Eliza felt a flush rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with fever. Before she could think of a response, they were interrupted by the sound of running feet, and Lily appeared around a corner, her face alight with excitement. "Papa, Miss Eliza, come quickly, there's a visitor." Marcus frowned. "A visitor? In this weather?" Lily nodded emphatically. "A man from Crescent Bay. He says he's been looking for Miss Eliza." Eliza felt a jolt of surprise. Someone from her village, here at East March? Who would make such a journey in the depths of winter? They followed Lily to the entrance hall, where a man stood stamping snow from his boots. He was middle-aged, with a weather-beaten face and the strong hands of someone used to physical labor. Eliza recognized him immediately. Thomas Fletcher, the village carpenter, whose wife Eliza had helped through a difficult birth 2 summers past. "Thomas," she said, stepping forward. "What are you doing here?" The man looked up, relief washing over his face. "Miss Reed, thank the gods. When we heard you'd gone off with some noblemen and hadn't returned." Eliza felt Marcus stiffen beside her, but she kept her attention on Thomas. "How did you find me?" "It wasn't easy," Thomas admitted. "But folk in the villages along the road remembered seeing you pass. And then when I reached the nearest town, everyone knew of Baron Thorne's estate." He glanced at Marcus, giving a belated, awkward bow. "Begging your pardon, my lord. I meant no disrespect." Marcus inclined his head stiffly. "None taken. Miss Reed has been recovering from an illness. She was in no condition to travel." Thomas's eyes widened as he took in Eliza's thin frame, the pallor of her skin. "You're ill? Is that why you haven't returned?" "Yes," Eliza said simply, seeing no reason to explain the full complexity of the situation. "But I'm improving. I hope to return to Crescent Bay when the weather permits." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. That's partly why I came. There's sickness in the village, Miss Reed. Started just after the first snow. 3 dead already, and more ailing. We need you." Eliza felt a cold that had nothing to do with winter seep into her bones. "What kind of sickness? What are the symptoms?" Thomas described them: fever, cough, weakness, pain in the chest. A common winter illness, perhaps, but one that could be deadly without proper treatment, especially among the very young and the elderly. "I have remedies that could help," Eliza said, thinking quickly. "In my cottage." "We've been through your stores," Thomas interrupted. "Used what we could make sense of. But it's not enough. We need you, Miss Reed." Eliza hesitated, torn. The people of Crescent Bay needed her, but she was still far from fully recovered. The journey would be difficult, perhaps dangerous in her weakened state. Marcus spoke before she could decide. "It's out of the question," he said firmly. "Miss Reed is still recovering. She can't travel in this weather, in her condition." Thomas looked from Marcus to Eliza, clearly uncertain. "But our people are dying," he said simply. The words hung in the air, a stark reminder of Eliza's responsibility to her village. She had been their healer for years. They depended on her, even if they kept their distance otherwise. "I have to go," she said quietly, meeting Marcus's gaze. "You must see that." "No, I don't see that at all," Marcus replied, his voice tight with anger or fear or both. "You're still ill. The journey could kill you." "I can't stay here in comfort while people die for lack of the knowledge I possess," Eliza insisted. "And what about your own life? Does that count for nothing?" Marcus demanded. Lily, who had been watching this exchange with wide eyes, suddenly spoke up. "Papa, Miss Eliza has to go. She's a healer, that's what she does. She helps people, even when it's hard." Marcus looked down at his daughter, conflicting emotions playing across his face. After a moment, he let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging in defeat. At least wait until tomorrow," he said to Eliza. "Rest, prepare properly. I'll provide a carriage, supplies, whatever you need." Eliza nodded, grateful for his understanding, even if it came reluctantly. "Thank you. That would be best." To Thomas, she added, "You'll stay the night, of course. Rest, get warm. We'll leave at first light." Thomas bowed again, deeper this time. "Thank you, Miss Reed. And you, my lord. The village won't forget this kindness." As servants led Thomas away to be fed and shown to a guest chamber, Eliza found herself alone with Marcus and Lily. The girl looked solemn but resolute, as if she understood perfectly what was happening. Marcus's face was harder to read, a complex mixture of resignation, worry, and something deeper that Eliza wasn't ready to name. I'll help you gather what you need, Lily offered. Thank you, Eliza said, touched by the girl's practicality in the face of impending separation. Marcus said nothing, simply turned and walked away, his back straight, his steps measured. Eliza watched him go, a hollow feeling expanding in her chest that had nothing to do with her illness. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Marcus came to Eliza's chamber. She was packing the last of her belongings, moving slowly but methodically, trying not to exhaust herself before the journey. You don't have to do this, he said without preamble, standing in the doorway. Eliza sighed, setting down the herb pouch she had been organizing. We've been through this, Baron Thorn. I do have to do this. It's my duty. Your duty. He spat the word as if it tasted bitter. And what of your duty to yourself? To your own health and well-being? My well-being isn't more important than the lives of others, Eliza said quietly. Marcus entered the room fully, closing the door behind him. Isn't it? You've already sacrificed so much. You nearly died saving Lily. Must you risk yourself again so soon? Eliza met his gaze steadily. This is who I am. This is what I do. You knew that when you came to Crescent Bay seeking my help. I didn't know I would. He stopped, running a hand through his hair in frustration. You would what? Eliza prompted, her heart beating faster despite herself. Marcus crossed the room in a few quick strides, stopping directly in front of her. I didn't know I would come to care for you, he said, his voice low and intense. That watching you suffer on my daughter's behalf would be its own kind of torment. That the thought of losing you now, when you're only just beginning to recover, would be unbearable. Eliza felt her breath catch in her throat. Marcus. He took her hands in his touch gentle but insistent. Stay. Not forever, if that's not what you want. Just until spring, until you're truly well again. I can send medicines, supplies, even physicians to Crescent Bay. But don't risk yourself like this. For a moment, Eliza wavered. The temptation to stay was strong, to remain in the warmth and comfort of East March, to continue the slow process of recovery, surrounded by care and attention, to explore whatever was growing between them, this unexpected connection that had formed in the midst of illness and healing. But then she thought of the village, of people suffering and dying while she hesitated, of the knowledge she carried, passed down through generations, knowledge that couldn't be replicated by city physicians with their bloodletting and purgatives. I can't, she said softly, genuine regret in her voice. People are dying, Marcus. I have the skill to help them. How could I live with myself if I chose comfort over their lives? Marcus's face tightened with pain, but after a moment he nodded. I understand, he said, his voice rough. I don't like it, but I understand. He released her hands, taking a step back. The carriage will be ready at dawn. I've ordered extra blankets, warming stones, provisions for the journey. Thomas knows the way. He'll guide you home. Thank you, Eliza said, feeling the distance growing between them already, a necessary separation before the physical one to come. Marcus moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at her. When spring comes, he said, when the road's clear and you're well again, will you send word, just to let us know how you fare? Of course. Eliza managed a smile, though it felt fragile on her lips. And perhaps when summer comes, Lily might like to visit Crescent Bay. The seaside can be beautiful then. Something in Marcus's face eased at this implicit promise of future connection. She would like that very much, he said. As would I. With that, he left, closing the door quietly behind him. Eliza stood motionless for a long moment, feeling the weight of choices made and paths chosen. Then she returned to her packing, preparing for the journey ahead, trying not to think about what and who she was leaving behind. Dawn came cold and clear, the sky lightening from black to deep blue to pale gold as the household of East March gathered to bid farewell. Marcus had indeed provided everything possible for Eliza's comfort. A well-sprung carriage with heated bricks for her feet, thick furs and blankets, provisions for the journey, and a small chest of remedies and supplies for the village. Lily hugged Eliza fiercely, pressing a small object into her hand. A carved wooden bird, its wings spread as if in flight. To remember us, the girl whispered. As if I could forget, Eliza replied, tucking the little bird carefully into her pocket. Marcus's farewell was more reserved, at least outwardly, a formal bow, a clasp of hands. But his eyes said what his words did not, and when he helped her into the carriage, his touch lingered, a silent plea or promise or both. Safe journey, he said simply. Thank you for everything, Eliza replied, knowing the words were inadequate for all that had passed between them. Then they were off, the carriage lurching into motion, Thomas riding alongside as guide and protector. Eliza looked back once, seeing Lily waving vigorously, Marcus standing straight and still, the morning sun catching in his dark hair, turning it to gold at the edges. Then a bend in the road hid them from view, and Eliza turned her face toward Crescent Bay, toward home, toward the duty that called her. Part 3. The Return. The journey to Crescent Bay was arduous, despite all of Marcus's provisions and precautions. Winter had the land firmly in its grip, the roads alternately icy and muddy, the cold a constant presence even within the carriage. Eliza's health, which had been improving at East March, suffered under the strain. By the time they reached the outskirts of Crescent Bay, 3 days later, her cough had returned in force, and the fever that had nearly subsided now burned again beneath her skin. But the sight of the village, nestled against the curve of the bay that gave it its name, brought a different kind of warmth to her heart. This was her home, had been for most of her life. The thatched cottages with smoke rising from their chimneys, the boats drawn up on the pebbly shore, the familiar shape of the hills rising behind. All of it called to something deep within her, a sense of belonging that transcended the villagers' occasional wariness of her and her skills. Word of her arrival spread quickly. By the time the carriage reached the village square, a small crowd had gathered, faces both anxious and relieved. Eliza saw immediately that Thomas had not exaggerated the situation. Many of the villagers looked ill, with flushed faces and hollow eyes, while others showed the haggard appearance of those who had been caring for the sick without respite. When she stepped down from the carriage, steadying herself against a wave of dizziness, a murmur went through the crowd. They had expected their healer to return strong and capable. Instead, they saw a woman almost as ill as those she had come to treat. "Miss Reed," said Margaret Harlow, the village elder's wife, stepping forward. "You don't look well yourself." "I've been ill," Eliza acknowledged. "But I'm recovering, and I'm here to help. Tell me how things stand." Margaret led her to the village hall, where many of the sickest had been gathered. As they walked, she explained how the illness had begun shortly after the first heavy snow, spreading rapidly from household to household. The symptoms were as Thomas had described: fever, cough, weakness, pain in the chest. The very young and the very old suffered worst, with 3 deaths already: an infant, an elderly man, and most recently, a woman in childbirth whose body had been too weakened by illness to survive the ordeal. "We've done what we could," Margaret said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "Used the remedies from your cottage that we recognized, kept them warm, tried to get broth and water into them. But it hasn't been enough." Eliza nodded, her mind already working through possibilities. The illness sounded like a severe form of the winter fever that sometimes swept through communities, especially those weakened by cold and poor nutrition. She had treated similar outbreaks before, with varying degrees of success. In the village hall, pallets had been arranged in rows, each holding a patient. The air was close and fetid, despite the small windows that had been cracked open for ventilation. Eliza moved from pallet to pallet, examining each patient, noting symptoms, assessing severity. Some were clearly improving, their fevers broken, their breathing easier. Others lay still and flushed, fighting for each breath, their faces contorted with pain. "First," she said to Margaret when the examination was complete, "we need to improve the air in here. Open the windows wider, bring in braziers with pine and cedar. The smoke will help clear the lungs. Second, I need helpers, people who have either recovered from the illness or seem resistant to it. They'll be less likely to fall ill themselves." Margaret nodded, dispatching messengers to carry out these instructions. Eliza continued, "From my supplies, I'll prepare remedies for different stages of the illness. Those who are improving will need something to strengthen them as they recover. Those in the worst stages need something to ease their breathing and reduce the fever." "And what of yourself?" Margaret asked pointedly. "You can barely stand." It was true. The effort of the examination had left Eliza trembling with exhaustion. But she pushed the weakness aside. "I'll rest when I can. For now, there's work to be done." The next several days passed in a blur of activity. Eliza established her base in the village hall, converting one corner into a makeshift apothecary where she prepared remedies from her supplies and from whatever local plants could be found in the winter landscape. She trained a group of assistants, young women mostly, who showed aptitude and interest, in the basics of caring for the ill: how to recognize changes in symptoms, how to administer remedies, how to position patients to ease breathing. Throughout, she fought her own recurring illness, working when she could, resting when she must. The villagers, seeing her dedication despite her own suffering, responded with a level of care and concern they had rarely shown before. They brought food to her cottage, ensured she had firewood, and when she grew too weak to walk the short distance from her home to the village hall, Thomas Fletcher himself carried her, as gently as if she were made of glass. Gradually, the tide began to turn. Fewer new cases appeared, and more of the existing patients showed signs of improvement. The remedies Eliza prepared, tinctures of yarrow and elderflower for fever, syrups of wild cherry bark and horehound for cough, poultices of mustard seed to ease chest pain, proved effective for most. But not for all. 2 more villagers died. An old woman whose heart gave out, and a young fisherman whose lungs filled with fluid faster than any remedy could clear them. Each death weighed on Eliza, even as she rationally knew that no healer, however skilled, could save everyone. By the beginning of February, the worst of the epidemic had passed. Most of the patients had returned to their homes, still weak but recovering. The village hall had been cleared and cleaned, returning to its normal function as a gathering place. Life in Crescent Bay began to resume its winter rhythm, mending nets, repairing boats, spinning and weaving, all the indoor tasks that filled the cold months when fishing was limited to the bravest or most desperate. Eliza returned fully to her own cottage, grateful for the familiar surroundings, the privacy, the comfort of her own bed. But she found the solitude strange after her time at East March, where there had always been Lily's bright curiosity or Marcus's quiet companionship to break the silence. She thought of them often, especially in the evenings when her work was done and the cottage grew quiet except for the crackling of the fire. She wondered how Lily fared, if she continued to grow stronger, if she still asked questions that adults found discomforting. She wondered if Marcus had returned to his normal routines, if the pain of almost losing his daughter had eased, if he thought of her as she thought of him. One evening, as February gave way to March and the first hints of spring began to appear, longer days, occasional birdsong, the softening of the frozen ground, Eliza sat by her fire, a half-finished letter before her. She had promised to send word when she was well again, and though she wasn't fully recovered, she was well enough for correspondence. But what to say? How to compress all that had happened, all that she felt, into words on a page? She had started and discarded several versions already. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Visitors were rare after dark. Most of the villagers preferred to conduct their business with the healer in daylight. Curious, Eliza rose and crossed to the door, opening it to find Margaret Harlow standing there, her face grave. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Miss Reed," Margaret said, "but there's someone asking for you. A man, just arrived in the village. Says he's come from East March." Eliza felt her heart lurch. From East March? Is it Thomas Fletcher again? Margaret shook her head. No, not him. A servant by his dress. He wouldn't say what brought him, only that he needed to speak with you urgently. Where is he now? At the inn. He looked exhausted, poor man. I told him I'd fetch you, if you were well enough to come. Eliza was already reaching for her cloak. I'll come now. The walk to the village inn was short, but Eliza felt every step. Her strength had been slow to return, the recurring fever and cough leaving her weaker than she liked to admit. By the time they reached the inn, she was breathing hard, her legs unsteady beneath her. The common room was nearly empty at this hour, just a few locals lingering over their ale. In a corner, a man sat alone, his travel-stained cloak marking him as a stranger. He rose as Eliza approached, bowing low. "Miss Reed," he said. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I'm William, steward of East March." "What brings you to Crescent Bay, William?" Eliza asked, dread building in her stomach. "Is it Lily? Has her illness returned?" William shook his head. "No, Miss Lily is well. Growing stronger every day." He hesitated, glancing at Margaret, who still stood beside Eliza. "It's all right," Eliza assured him. "Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of Mrs. Harlow." William nodded, clearly relieved not to have to ask for privacy that might seem suspicious. "It's Baron Thorn, miss. He's fallen ill. The same sickness that struck Miss Lily, by all appearances. He's been failing rapidly these past 2 weeks." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." But even as she said it, she knew it was not only possible, but perhaps inevitable. The balance that had been struck when she healed Lily, it had been incomplete. She had taken some of the illness into herself. Yes, but not all of it. Some essence of it had remained at East March, dormant, waiting. And now it had found a new host in Marcus. "The Baron instructed me to come to you," William continued. He said you would understand what was happening, that you might know how to help him." Yes, Eliza said, her mind racing. Yes, I understand. Margaret looked from one to the other, confusion evident on her face. Miss Reed, you're in no condition to travel again so soon. You've barely recovered from your own illness. I have to go, Eliza said simply. She turned to William. How did you travel here? By horse, miss. It's faster than a carriage on the winter roads. Eliza nodded. We'll leave at first light. I need tonight to prepare. After William had gone to rest, promising to be ready at dawn, Margaret walked back with Eliza to her cottage. The older woman was clearly troubled. I don't understand what's happening, she said as they reached Eliza's door. But I can see it's important to you. Just take care of yourself, Miss Reed. The village needs you. Eliza was touched by the concern. I'll be careful, she promised. And I'll return as soon as I can. Inside her cottage, she moved with purpose, gathering the supplies she would need. This time, she knew exactly what she was facing. This time, there would be no uncertainty about the price to be paid. All night, she worked, preparing the remedies that might save Marcus's life. As she worked, she thought about balance and sacrifice, about choices made and their consequences, about the connections that formed between people, unexpected and profound, and the lengths to which one might go for those connections. By dawn, she was ready. William was waiting at the village square with 2 horses, a sturdy gelding for himself and a gentle mare for Eliza. Margaret and several other villagers had gathered to see her off, concern evident in their faces. We'll look after things here, Margaret assured her. Just come back to us when you can. Eliza thanked her, touched by the woman's concern and by the nods of agreement from the others. Something had shifted during the epidemic. The villagers no longer held themselves apart from her quite so obviously. They had worked alongside her, seen her vulnerability as well as her strength, recognized her as one of their own. The journey to East March was as difficult as Eliza had expected. Though the worst of winter had passed, the roads were still challenging, alternating between mud and ice. Her strength, not fully restored after her own illness, and the exertions of treating the village, flagged quickly. By the end of each day, she could barely stay in the saddle, and William had to help her dismount and settle her by the fire at whatever inn they found for the night. But she pushed on, driven by urgency and by something deeper, a pull toward East March, toward Marcus, that she could no longer deny or resist. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they crested the familiar hill, and Eliza saw East March below, just as she had months before. But this time, there was no smoke rising from the chimneys, no warm glow of lanterns in the windows. The estate looked eerily still, as if holding its breath. As they rode down to the manor, Eliza felt the weight of what lay ahead. She knew what needed to be done, knew the cost it would exact. The question was whether she had the strength to pay that price, and whether Marcus would allow her to. Servants met them in the courtyard, their faces drawn with worry. One helped Eliza from her horse, steadying her when she swayed with exhaustion. The Baron? William asked, his voice tight with concern. No change, the servant replied grimly. The physician says he won't last the week. Eliza gripped her bag of remedies tighter. Take me to him, she said. Now. They led her through the familiar halls of East March, up the grand staircase, to the master's chamber, a room she had never entered during her previous stay. It was larger than the guest chamber she had occupied, with heavy oak furniture and tapestries lining the walls. A massive 4-poster bed dominated the space, and in it lay Marcus Thorne. Eliza's breath caught at the sight of him. He was wasted, his face gaunt, his skin ashen except for the hectic flush of fever on his cheeks. His breathing was labored, each inhalation a struggle, each exhalation a rasp. His eyes were closed, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. He looked, Eliza thought with a pang, exactly as Lily had when she first saw her. A small figure rose from a chair beside the bed. Lily herself, her face pale with fear, but her eyes clear and determined. Miss Eliza, she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. You came. Of course I came, Eliza replied, crossing to the bed, her own exhaustion forgotten in the face of the task before her. She set her bag down on the bedside table and placed a gentle hand on Marcus's forehead. Burning hot, as she had expected. How long has he been like this? She asked, already examining him as she had examined Lily months before. It started 2 weeks ago, Lily said, watching Eliza's every move. Just after he received your letter, saying you were getting better. At first he said it was nothing, just a winter chill. But then he got worse and worse, and now. Her voice faltered for the first time. Eliza looked up sharply. My letter? But I never sent. She stopped, understanding dawning. The letter she had been drafting the very night William arrived. Somehow, Marcus had received a similar one. Or believed he had. It doesn't matter, she said, returning to her examination. What matters is helping him now. The symptoms were identical to what Lily had experienced, to what Eliza herself had suffered in diminished form. The same wasting illness, the same struggle for breath, the same inexorable decline. But now Eliza understood what she was seeing. Not just a physical ailment, but the working out of a balance that could not be denied. A life for a life. Health for health. The scales demanded equilibrium. Lily, she said gently, I need to prepare some remedies for your father. The same ones I used for you. Will you help me? The girl nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to have something useful to do. Together, they set up a small work table by the fire, where Eliza laid out the herbs and tinctures she had brought. As they worked, Eliza explained each step, each ingredient, just as she had done during Lily's convalescence. But there was one remedy she prepared alone, after sending Lily to fetch fresh water. The dark liquid, the last and most crucial treatment, the one that had saved Lily's life at the cost of Eliza's health. The one that would now save Marcus, at a price Eliza was prepared to pay. When all was ready, Eliza administered the first two remedies, coaxing them past Marcus's parched lips. As with Lily, there was an immediate slight improvement. His breathing eased a fraction, some of the tension left his frame. Then came the moment for the third remedy, the dark one. Eliza held the vial, looking from Marcus to Lily, who watched with solemn understanding beyond her years. This will make him sleep, Eliza explained, just as she had with Lily. When he wakes, he should be much improved. And you? Lily asked quietly. What will happen to you? Eliza met the girl's clear blue gaze. There was no point in lying to this child who saw too much, understood too deeply. I will become ill again, she said simply. As I did before. Lily's face crumpled, tears filling her eyes. But that's not fair. Why should you have to suffer for us? Because that's how the balance works, Eliza said gently. A life saved requires something in return. A price must be paid. Then let me pay it. Lily cried. It's my father. I should be the one. No. Eliza's voice was firm. That's not how it works either. The balance has already been set in motion. It must be completed. Lily stared at her, tears streaming down her face. Then, with a sudden movement, she reached out and grasped the vial from Eliza's hand. Lily, no. Eliza exclaimed, trying to reclaim it, but the girl darted away. I won't let you do this, Lily said, her young face set in stubborn lines. Not again. Not for us. Lily, please, Eliza pleaded. You don't understand. Without that remedy, your father will die. But with it, you might die instead, Lily countered. I heard the servants talking. They said you nearly died after healing me, that you've never fully recovered. If you do this again so soon. Eliza couldn't deny the truth of this. She was still weak from her first encounter with the illness, from the strain of tending to the epidemic in Crescent Bay. Taking on Marcus's illness now, when she had so little strength to spare. Yes, it might well kill her, but the alternative was unthinkable. Lily, she said, softening her voice, approaching the girl slowly. I know you're frightened. I know you don't want anyone else to suffer. But this is my choice to make. My gift to give. Please, let me help your father. For a long moment, Lily stood frozen, the vial clutched in her small hand. Then, slowly, her shoulders slumped, and she held out the remedy. Promise me you won't die, she whispered. Eliza took the vial gently. I promise I'll fight with everything I have, she said, which was the most she could honestly offer. Returning to Marcus's bedside, she carefully administered the dark liquid, supporting his head as he swallowed. Then she settled him back against the pillows and waited, just as she had with Lily, for the remedy.